January 1942, the North Atlantic. A biting wind tore across the deck of HMS Javelin, whipping rain into the eyes of the men stationed at the rails. Darkness pressed in from all sides, broken only by the occasional flare of a distant explosion. Waves struck the steel hull with relentless force, each impact sending tremors up through the knees of the sailors. The ship shuddered under the punishment, yet it held, unyielding, as if the Atlantic itself could not swallow her. Above, the captain's voice cut through the storm, calm but firm, issuing orders for evasive maneuvers against the lurking U-boat menace. Down in the engine room, mechanics clung to controls, their hands slick with seawater and oil, hearts hammering with the rhythm of the engines. A torpedo struck the starboard side, an explosion that would have sunk an older vessel in moments. Yet the destroyer rose again, her compartments sealed, her structure absorbing the strike as if by design. In that instant, the men understood that the resilience of their ship was no accident. It was the product of one engineer's vision, long dismissed as reckless, even mad by his peers. His designs had tested every convention, challenged every naval assumption, and now, under fire, they proved their worth. The ship was not merely surviving, she was redefining what a destroyer could endure. It was here, in the relentless cold of the Atlantic, with death all around, that Britain's quiet genius revealed itself. And it began not with guns or strategy, but with steel, calculation, and the audacious mind of a single engineer. This was more than innovation. It was salvation at sea, and the story of the man behind it was only beginning. By the spring of 1940, the seas surrounding Britain had become a battleground. The island nation, dependent on maritime lifelines for food, fuel, and raw materials, faced an invisible enemy, Germany's U-boats. Operating in wolf packs across the North Atlantic, they sank merchant ships with chilling precision, aiming to strangle Britain's economy before a single German soldier ever set foot on her shores. Convoys became the nation's arteries of survival. Columns of merchant vessels stretching across the horizon carried everything from Canadian wheat to American munitions. Escorting them were the Royal Navy's destroyers, sleek, fast, and perilously thin-skinned. Their role was both defensive and sacrificial, to shield the convoys from torpedoes, to hunt submarines, and, if necessary, to draw fire away from the ships they protected. The destroyer was the symbol of British endurance at sea, graceful yet vulnerable, powerful yet fragile. The Admiralty knew that these ships were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Reports from 1940 and 1941 showed alarming trends. More than 100 British destroyers damaged or sunk within months, many going down within minutes of a torpedo strike. The Royal Navy's official war diaries, later preserved in the National Archives at Kew, record captains describing their ships breaking their backs under blast stress, or shearing open like tin under the sea's pressure. It was a brutal reality of modern naval warfare. The destroyer's long, narrow hull, ideal for speed, also made it structurally weak. A single torpedo or mine could cause catastrophic flexing, snapping the ship amidships. Salvage reports showed the same recurring pattern. The forward compartments flooded rapidly, power failed, and within moments, the vessel rolled and sank. For the men who served aboard them, survival often depended on luck and proximity to rescue. The psychological toll was immense. Crews became accustomed to the sound of steel twisting, the deafening roar of ruptured bulkheads, and the desperate cries of comrades in the freezing Atlantic waters. The Admiralty's internal memoranda reveal growing anxiety, how to design a destroyer that could withstand such punishment without sacrificing speed or agility. By 1941, Britain's shipyards were at full stretch. From the Clyde to Barrow-in-Furness, welders worked around the clock. Yet even as production increased, losses mounted. The German U-boat offensive grew bolder, striking deep into convoy routes once thought safe. In these months, the Royal Navy sought not just more ships, but better ones. Amidst this urgency, a handful of engineers began proposing ideas that bordered on heresy. They argued that Britain's destroyers were being built to peacetime standards, too light, too conventional. They envisioned designs that could absorb massive structural damage without breaking apart. Among them was one figure whose proposals would provoke ridicule and resistance before transforming naval design. A naval architect who believed that a destroyer could, quite literally, be made unsinkable. In committee rooms at the Admiralty, his suggestions were met with skepticism. Senior officers, many veterans of Jutland, trusted tradition over experimentation. A destroyer must be swift, they argued, not armored like a battleship. Yet beneath the skepticism lay desperation. The Navy could ill afford to ignore a concept that might save hundreds of ships and thousands of lives. Meanwhile, on the open seas, the consequences of inaction were stark. Convoys HX-79 and SC-7, attacked in October 1940, lost nearly 40 merchant ships in just 2 nights. The destroyer escorts fought valiantly, but their losses and damage underscored the urgency of change. Naval engineers were tasked with finding solutions: compartmentalization, improved damage control systems, and hull reinforcement. But it would take someone unafraid to be labeled eccentric or mad to truly change the game. The British naval establishment was entering a period of profound transformation. What had begun as a war of numbers was fast becoming a war of engineering. The challenge was no longer just to outfight the enemy, but to outthink him, to design ships that could endure what human courage alone could not. And so, in the offices of the Admiralty and the drafting rooms of the Royal Corps of Naval Constructors, a quiet revolution began, one that would redefine the future of the destroyer and the fate of the sailors who manned them. His name was Sir Stanley Goodall, Director of Naval Construction at the Admiralty, and one of the most influential, if least celebrated, minds in British maritime history. A reserved man of sharp intellect and unshakable conviction, Goodall had spent his career studying the anatomy of ships under strain. By 1939, as war loomed, he was convinced that the Royal Navy's destroyers were, in his words, ships of elegance, not endurance. Goodall's office at Bath was a world of blueprints, slide rules, and salt-stained reports. His team of naval architects studied the wreckage of torpedoed destroyers, examining how steel bent and fractured under explosive force. From those fragments, he began to see a pattern and a solution. His proposal was deceptively simple: to make the destroyer a vessel that could sustain massive structural damage and still remain afloat long enough for her crew to fight, repair, or escape. It was, at first hearing, a heresy. The destroyer had always been defined by speed. Armor was for cruisers and battleships. To strengthen a destroyer's hull meant adding weight, slowing it, dulling its agility. But Goodall's idea was not to reinforce with bulk, but to reinvent with balance. He proposed a hull form built around compartmentalized buoyancy, a structure divided into multiple, independently sealed sections designed to contain flooding and preserve stability. He described it as a self-surviving hull. Critics at the Admiralty dismissed it as unnecessarily complex, impractical in wartime, production, even mad. Yet Goodall persisted. He knew that torpedoes, not surface guns, were the destroyer's true enemy. His design would ensure that even a direct hit amidships would not doom the vessel. The explosion might cripple her engines or disable her guns, but she would stay afloat. The inspiration for his concept came from both engineering observation and human empathy. Goodall had read the casualty lists from destroyers lost off Norway, Dunkirk, and Crete. He noted how quickly the ships sank, often within minutes, leaving little time for rescue. In one report, a captain described how the ship folded like a matchstick after a torpedo blast. To Goodall, this was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of design. His breakthrough came with the J, K, and N-class destroyers, built from 1938 onwards, and later refined in the Battle and Daring classes. They incorporated reinforced longitudinal framing, a structural skeleton designed to distribute shock waves along the length of the hull. The design also improved transverse watertight bulkheads, reducing the domino effect of flooding that had doomed earlier ships. In modern terms, Goodall had introduced redundancy, a destroyer that could lose half her buoyancy and still float. He insisted on extensive tank testing, scale models subjected to blast simulations in the Admiralty's experimental basins. Observers noted that while older designs broke their backs under pressure, Goodall's frames flexed, absorbed, and recovered. He spoke quietly but firmly of the principle. A ship must not be rigid. She must live with the sea. By 1941, as reports of losses mounted, the Admiralty grudgingly approved experimental production using his methods. The shipbuilders at Vickers, Thornycroft, and Yarrow began adapting his plans. Workers grumbled about extra plating and fiddly frameworks. Yard foremen questioned why they were changing tried and tested patterns during wartime. But at sea, every saved life became proof that Goodall's obsession was no folly. The new destroyers, heavier, yes, but markedly more resilient, began to emerge. HMS Javelin, HMS Kipling, HMS Jackal, and others built under Goodall's revised specifications demonstrated something extraordinary. They could take punishment and remain afloat. In November 1940, Javelin herself was struck by 2 torpedoes off Plymouth. Her bow and stern were blown away, yet her midsection remained buoyant. Against all expectations, she was towed to safety, living. Proof of Goodall's philosophy. Admiralty. Engineers re-examined the wreck and confirmed what Goodall had always claimed. The ship's survival had hinged on structural flexibility and compartmentalization. What had once been derided as Goodall's madness was rapidly becoming Royal Navy doctrine. But behind this success was a deeper shift, one that reflected Britain's broader wartime ingenuity. The war forced the nation to abandon pride and embrace practicality. From radar and code-breaking to the humble Nissen hut, British innovation flourished under necessity. The destroyer redesign was part of the same spirit. Unglamorous, methodical, born of quiet determination rather than grand gestures. The story of Britain's unsinkable destroyers was not only one of engineering triumph, it was also a moral one, of persistence in the face of skepticism, of courage not on the battlefield, but at the drafting table. The Admiralty's technical archives later described Goodall's work as a decisive step toward the preservation of naval lives. By late 1942, British destroyers began returning from missions bearing scars that would have been fatal only 2 years earlier. The crews themselves noticed the difference. The ship flexed, groaned, but did not break. In mess halls and wardrooms, men spoke quietly of their ships, taking a beating and holding. It was the dawn of a new era in naval architecture, one that redefined what survival meant at sea. And it had begun with a man dismissed as a dreamer. As the Atlantic War intensified, Goodall's ideas would face their ultimate test. In fire, steel, and salt water, when the destroyers met the full fury of the German U-boat packs. Every destroyer was more than a machine. It was a living rhythm of men and metal. Below deck, the air was thick with oil and tension. Engines throbbed like a heartbeat, echoing through the steel ribs of the hull. On the bridge, officers scanned the black horizon, where the enemy could strike without warning. The North Atlantic did not forgive mistakes. For the sailors, Goodall's mad design was not an abstraction. It became the difference between life and death. Survivors of the Javelin, Kipling, and Jackal often spoke of the moment they realized their ship was still afloat. The disbelief, then the rush of gratitude. "We thought she'd gone," one petty officer later recalled, "but she stayed under us, shaking, creaking, but alive." There was a quiet pride in that endurance. The men did not speak of heroism, nor did they need to. Their courage lay in their steadiness, in holding their posts as the deck trembled, in sealing off compartments while water roared in lighting cigarettes in the dark after the shock of a torpedo hit. The ship's resilience became a mirror of their own. On shore leave, few spoke of Goodall by name. His work was buried under layers of secrecy and bureaucracy. Yet, unknowingly, thousands owed him their lives. The design's purpose was not glory, but survival. It allowed sailors to fight longer, rescue their comrades, and return home, something that, in wartime Britain, was miracle enough to the families waiting in port cities. Portsmouth, Plymouth, Glasgow. Every telegram that read, "Ship damaged but afloat," was a silent triumph of that same ingenuity. In the pubs and dockyards, word spread of the new destroyers that wouldn't go under. It gave the nation a subtle, precious gift. Hope that British craftsmanship, not just courage, could outlast the storm. At the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, tactics were dictated as much by survival as by aggression. The convoy escorts had to strike a delicate balance, engage the enemy while shielding their vulnerable charges. A single sunk destroyer could leave dozens of merchantmen exposed. Goodall's redesign quietly altered the equation. By reducing the likelihood of catastrophic loss, the Royal Navy could sustain tighter convoy formations and hold engagement lines longer. Ships that might once have withdrawn after damage could now remain operational, providing cover fire or sonar tracking even when limping. Naval logs from 1942-43 reveal how captains began adapting their tactics. Commanders noted that the newer destroyers could withstand near misses and continue maneuvers that would have crippled older vessels. This resilience allowed for more aggressive anti-submarine sweeps. Rather than breaking formation after a torpedo strike, damaged ships could hold their position while repairs were made. In operational terms, this changed everything. U-boat commanders, once confident that a single hit would eliminate an escort, now faced opponents that refused to die. Reports captured by Bletchley Park intelligence hinted at German frustration. English destroyer hit, remains active. Impossible to finish. Goodall's design thus extended beyond engineering. It became a tactical asset, an invisible ally that allowed British naval strategy to evolve from desperate defense to calculated endurance. The Unsinkable destroyer was, in its own quiet way, a weapon of time. Each additional minute afloat meant another merchantman saved, another depth charge deployed, another convoy that reached port. The change did not appear on maps or in communiques, yet it rippled through the entire Atlantic War. The line between victory and defeat, between survival and annihilation, was measured in minutes. And Goodall had given Britain more of them. Beneath the romantic imagery of the Royal Navy lay a science as meticulous as it was innovative. The destroyer's rebirth was a triumph of engineering logic over tradition. The core of Goodall's design rested on two principles: longitudinal strength and controlled flooding. Older ships relied on transverse frames, ribs across the hull that provided rigidity but little flexibility. When struck, this rigidity became their undoing. The energy of the explosion traveled through the ship like a shock wave, snapping it apart. Goodall's idea was to distribute that energy. He strengthened the keel and lengthwise frames, allowing the hull to flex rather than fracture. It was an idea inspired as much by nature as by mechanics, like the way a tree bends under wind but does not break. Equally revolutionary was his approach to compartmentalization. Traditional destroyers featured watertight bulkheads, but these were often compromised by shared ventilation and wiring conduits. Goodall's team rerouted systems to ensure complete isolation between compartments. He described the approach as sacrificing the wounded limb to save the body. The result was a vessel capable of remaining upright even with catastrophic damage. In damage control drills, sections of test hulls were deliberately flooded. Unlike earlier models, they stayed balanced, buoyant, and structurally coherent. This precision engineering was accompanied by new materials and methods. Riveting was gradually replaced by welding, a controversial shift at the time, creating smoother, more watertight joints. The use of high-tensile D-steel increased resilience without excessive weight. These changes demanded retraining thousands of shipyard workers, a massive wartime undertaking quietly achieved across Britain's industrial heartlands. In technical memoranda from 1943, Admiralty scientists recorded that the redesigned destroyers showed increased survival probability of up to 38% after major torpedo damage. Such numbers rarely reached the public eye, yet they reflected a deeper truth. Britain's naval survival was not a matter of luck, but of calculation. The war was fought not only by those on the bridge, but also by those behind the drawing boards. And in that unseen war of innovation, Goodall's madness became method, his defiance, the blueprint of endurance. Leadership during wartime often demands more than bravery. It demands the courage to trust what cannot yet be proven. Within the Admiralty, such trust was rare. Tradition ran deep in the Royal Navy, a service that prized seamanship, discipline, and continuity above experimentation. Yet by 1941, the old certainties were failing. Ships were sinking faster than they could be built. Change was no longer a matter of preference. It was survival. Among those who recognized this early was Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, the first Sea Lord. He was no radical, yet he possessed a quiet pragmatism. In his private correspondence with the Ministry of Supply, he acknowledged a duty to consider the unconventional if it may preserve our fighting strength. Under his tenure, Goodall's team received cautious backing, enough to test, to build, and eventually to prove. But it was Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, and later Prime Minister, who gave moral cover to innovation. Churchill had an instinct for engineering and an impatience for bureaucratic resistance. His wartime minutes, preserved in the Churchill papers, reveal his frustration with naval conservatism and his insistence on constructive heresy, his phrase for ideas that might sound absurd until they worked. When early reports from Javelin and Kipling confirmed the survivability of the new destroyers, Churchill's handwritten note to the Admiralty was characteristically brief. "Continue Goodall's work. The sea has proved him right." Such moments of leadership were decisive. In a climate of uncertainty and fear, they allowed risk-takers to operate. Admiralty officers, once skeptical, began to see the broader vision. A navy capable not merely of fighting, but of enduring. Leadership here was not about orders barked across decks or grand speeches in Parliament. It was about steady endorsement, giving engineers, builders, and captains alike the confidence to persevere. Behind every successful design lay a chain of belief. From the Prime Minister's pen to the draftsman's table, from the shipyard foreman's torch to the helmsman's grip on the wheel. Without that belief, innovation would have remained nothing more than drawings on a desk in Bath. Innovation in wartime carries a moral weight. Every new idea is tested not in laboratories but in lives. Goodall knew this. His colleagues at the Royal Corps of Naval Constructors did too. To change the structure of a destroyer was to alter the odds of survival, to gamble with the fate of crews who had no say in the matter. This awareness shaped the tone of their work. The engineers approached each blueprint not as inventors seeking acclaim, but as custodians of human life. Theirs was an ethic of precision, the belief that one rivet placed correctly could mean a dozen men saved. Yet there were controversies. Some officers accused the Admiralty of experimenting with crews. When the first destroyers built under the new design went into service, not all captains trusted them. The heavier frame affected maneuverability in high seas. The altered balance required new handling. Training manuals had to be rewritten. Damage control teams retrained. In an age when experience was everything, these changes felt unsettling. But gradually, the moral argument shifted. Reports from survivors carried undeniable weight. One letter to the Admiralty, written by a lieutenant after his ship survived a torpedo strike off Tobruk, read simply, "We floated long enough to get our wounded clear." That was the difference. That difference, measured in minutes, perhaps hours, became the justification. Goodall's design was not about invincibility. It was about mercy through engineering. In the moral calculus of war, where destruction so often defined progress, here was a rare inversion, a design whose purpose was to preserve. Philosophers and theologians later wrote of the Second World War as a struggle between mechanized death and human decency. Few would think to include naval construction in that reflection. Yet, within those steel hulls lay an act of moral defiance. Proof that even amid the machinery of war, Britain could build not only to kill, but to save. By 1943, this ethos had quietly spread across British industry. In aircraft factories, radar labs, and intelligence units, engineers echoed the same creed. If innovation could save lives, then to hesitate was a moral failure. Goodall's work, though seldom publicized, embodied that conviction. It was this fusion of moral intent and mechanical skill that gave Britain its edge, the unspoken faith that ingenuity, when guided by conscience, could hold back the tide. March 1942. Convoy HX-229, 62 merchant ships, stretching across the gray expanse of the North Atlantic, plowed through sleet and towering waves. Somewhere beyond the fog, the wolf packs were waiting. German U-boats, guided by enigma-coded coordinates, prepared to strike. For Britain, this convoy carried more than cargo. It carried proof that the new destroyer designs could withstand the enemy's most ruthless onslaught. Among the escorting vessels was HMS Havelock, a ship built under the revised plans drawn by Sir Stanley Goodall's office. Sleek and unassuming, she embodied the new philosophy of survival. Flexible strength, sealed compartments, structural endurance. Her officers trusted her, though they had yet to see how far that trust could stretch. The night of 16th of March began in eerie calm. The ocean was a sheet of black glass, disturbed only by the hum of engines and the pulse of radar. Then, at 1:25 hours, sonar detected movement, the telltale rhythm of diesel engines below the waves. The alarm sounded through the corridors. Men scrambled to action stations. Depth charges were primed. The first explosion came minutes later. A merchant vessel, SS Renfield, torpedoed amidships. Flames rose from her deck. The destroyers moved in to defend, forming a barrier against the invisible threat. Havelock swung hard to port, sonar pinging, propellers churning foam into the dark. The next torpedo came straight for her. The impact was ferocious. It struck just aft of the bridge, a direct hit. A wall of fire and water rose 20 feet high. Men were thrown from their posts, scalded by steam, deafened by the roar of ruptured steel. For a moment, all was chaos. But as the spray cleared, something remarkable happened. The ship did not list. The deck, though fractured, remained level. In the engine room, power faltered, then steadied. The crew, dazed and soaked, braced for the roll that never came. The watertight bulkheads had held. Flooding was contained within 2 compartments, precisely as Goodall's calculations had predicted. Damage control teams moved in with pumps and shoring beams. Above, the captain, shaken but composed, issued the order: maintain speed, continue escort. Reports from survivors later described the scene as almost surreal. The destroyer torn open, yet alive. The hull's longitudinal framing had absorbed the blast energy, preventing catastrophic flexure. Even with a section of her bow destroyed, Havelock maintained enough buoyancy to maneuver. She fought on for 6 more hours, deploying depth charges that forced 3 U-boats to break contact. At dawn, the convoy reached relative safety. The sea was littered with debris, but Havelock was still afloat. Her crew, bruised and bloodied, manned their stations in silence. They had witnessed the impossible. A ship surviving a hit that, 2 years earlier, would have split her in half. In the Admiralty's post-action analysis, recorded in the damage control reports of March 1942, later archived at Kew, the conclusion was understated yet monumental. The revised structural design has demonstrated a marked improvement in hull integrity and survivability under torpedo impact. Those simple words masked the scale of their significance. For the first time, Britain had tangible proof that engineering could outwit destruction. The destroyer's endurance was no longer theory. It was fact, tested in fire and salt water. News of Havelock's survival reached Churchill within days. He wrote in the margin of the report, his handwriting urgent and slanted, "Goodall's design has saved the ship, and perhaps the convoy. Proceed with expansion of this method. Every yard must know it." Shipyards along the Clyde and Tyne began refitting existing destroyers to match the new structural standards. The results were immediate. Over the following months, ships struck by torpedoes off Iceland, Malta, and the Bay of Biscay survived long enough for crews to be rescued or for repair ships to tow them home. At sea, sailors began to notice subtle differences. The flecks beneath their boots during rough weather, the way the hull seemed to breathe rather than shatter under pressure. These sensations, once disconcerting, became symbols of faith. "She bends," one lieutenant observed in a letter to his wife, "but she will not break." The climax of Britain's naval endurance was not a single battle, but a pattern of survival repeated across oceans. Ships crippled yet afloat, convoys mauled yet delivered. The war at sea was far from over, but something fundamental had shifted. For the men who fought it, that shift was invisible, measured only in lives spared and missions completed. For those who designed it, it was the vindication of reason over skepticism, science over convention. And yet, there was still one more test to come. One that would push Goodall's principles to their absolute limit. In waters far deadlier than the Atlantic by mid-1943, the Mediterranean had become a cauldron. Axis supply lines strained to sustain their forces in North Africa, while British convoys braved minefields, submarines, and the unrelenting assault of the Luftwaffe. Every crossing, from Gibraltar to Alexandria, tested the endurance of men and metal alike. Among the escort group for convoy MW-27 to Malta was HMS Paladin, a newly commissioned destroyer built under the final iteration of Goodall's Unsinkable design. Her hull incorporated every lesson learned from the North Atlantic. Compartmentalized voids, strengthened keel girders, and anti-flash bulkheads surrounding the boiler rooms. She was, in essence, a floating thesis in survival. At dawn on 15th of July, 1943, the convoy slipped through calm waters south of Sicily. Overhead, the sky shimmered with heat. Radar picked up faint echoes, distant, flickering shapes moving fast. Within minutes, alarms blared. Junkers' Ju-88 bombers were inbound, flying low across the glare. Paladin's guns opened first. Tracers streaked upward, orange against blue. The sea erupted in white plumes as bombs fell among the merchantmen. One exploded close aboard Paladin, the concussion throwing men to the deck. But the destroyer's hull, designed to flex under shock, absorbed the blast energy. Plates buckled. They did not tear. Moments later, another wave descended. A direct hit struck near the aft magazine. Fire roared through the superstructure. The order was given to flood the compartment, a decision made possible only because the ship's subdivided design allowed selective sacrifice. Engineers in oil-slicked uniforms sealed the hatches by hand, cutting off the flames from the ammunition store. They worked in near darkness, the heat so intense it blistered paint from the bulkheads. Above deck, Paladin rolled sharply, but righted herself. The crew fought the fires with hoses and grit. The ship's internal pressure held, her compartments doing exactly what Goodall's equations had intended. Where older destroyers might have capsized from asymmetric flooding, Paladin stayed afloat. For 3 hours the battle raged. Bombs fell, torpedoes streaked, and every destroyer in the screen took damage. Yet when the attack subsided, all but one remained operational. The convoy pressed on. That evening, as the Mediterranean sun dipped behind the haze, the men aboard Paladin stood at the rails and watched the horizon. Smoke rose from several ships, but Malta lay ahead. The destroyer limped into Grand Harbor, battered and charred, but upright. Dockworkers and naval officers watched in silence as she entered port under her own power. An engineer from the Admiralty's technical mission, inspecting the damage days later, recorded his observations in Report Number 72/43, Mediterranean Operations, Structural Integrity Assessment. The vessel sustained 2 near-miss bomb explosions and 1 direct impact. Despite severe deformation of outer plating, internal stability remained uncompromised. No progressive flooding observed. Design integrity validated under extreme conditions. It was the most conclusive test yet. In the Atlantic, the design had survived cold and pressure. In the Mediterranean, it had endured fire and impact. The phrase, "unsinkable destroyer," once dismissed as naval bravado, now held weight within the Admiralty. Sir Stanley Goodall, typically restrained in public comment, allowed himself a rare smile when the report reached his desk. To a colleague at Bath, he wrote, "It seems the ships have proven themselves. If they keep the sea, then perhaps the skeptics will finally let us build for tomorrow, not yesterday." Churchill, too, took notice. In a memo circulated among the War Cabinet's Defense Committee, he wrote, "Our strength lies not only in courage, but in the cleverness of our craftsmen. Let the enemy learn that our ships are designed to survive." From that point, the design principles pioneered by Goodall and his team became the template for post-war destroyers. Their impact extended beyond the Royal Navy, influencing Allied shipyards in Canada, Australia, and the United States. But in 1943, for the men who sailed these vessels, the triumph was simpler. It was the knowledge that if they were struck, if the sea came for them, their ship would fight to stay alive long enough for them to fight back. The era of fragile warships was over. Britain's destroyers had become instruments of endurance, steel embodiments of the nation's spirit. Battered, scarred, yet never broken, and as the tides of war turned decisively in the Allies' favor, the quiet revolution of naval design had already secured one of its most vital victories. A triumph not of glory, but of resilience. By late 1943, Britain's shipyards had transformed. The lessons learned from Havelock and Paladin had traveled from the drawing boards of Bath to the slipways of the Clyde, Belfast, and Barrow-in-Furness. Engineers, draftsmen, and welders, many of whom had never seen the ocean beyond the dock gates, were now building vessels that embodied the hard-won wisdom of war. At the heart of this transformation was the idea that survival was as vital as firepower. For every destroyer launched, the Admiralty demanded reports on weight distribution, bulkhead strength, and damage control efficiency. The Director of Naval Construction Technical Circular, Number 2117-43, mandated the new structural principles across all classes. Watertight integrity, once a bureaucratic formality, became a sacred discipline. The figures told their own story. Between 1942 and 1944, the Royal Navy lost 20 schooners, fewer destroyers to hull failure after impact compared with the first 3 years of war. Torpedo hits that once guaranteed disaster now resulted in controlled damage. Crews had minutes, sometimes hours, to seal off flooded compartments, fight fires, and save their ships. Those minutes, multiplied across hundreds of engagements, meant lives. For the men who sailed, this new confidence changed the rhythm of war. Officers no longer saw a torpedo warning as a death sentence. Damage control drills became almost ritualistic, performed with the calm precision of a tea ceremony. Methodical, exacting, deeply British. The knowledge that the ship beneath them was designed to endure gave them courage of a different kind. The courage to stay at their posts. In the war diaries preserved at the Imperial War Museum, entries from destroyer crews reveal this quiet faith. A petty officer aboard HMS Zetland recorded after surviving a mine blast off the Adriatic. "She shook like thunder, and every man thought she'd gone. But when the smoke cleared, she was still right under us, humming steady. We gave her a cheer, like you would an old friend who's just stood up after a hard hit." It was a sentiment echoed across the fleet. Affection for machines that seemed almost alive in their determination to stay afloat. Meanwhile, in the offices of the Admiralty, the recognition of what had been achieved began to spread. Goodall, though modest to a fault, was awarded the Companion of the Order of the Bath in 1944 for services to naval architecture and wartime construction. His innovations were incorporated into the next generation of destroyers. The battle class, whose long, lean hulls became the backbone of the post-war fleet. Yet Goodall was quick to remind colleagues that the victory was collective. In his notes he wrote, "It was the men who welded and riveted, who tested the bulkheads, who refused to accept good enough. Engineering is courage in slow motion." As the war pressed on into its final brutal stages, these ships became the guardians of the sea lanes, feeding Britain's survival. They escorted convoys through Arctic ice, hunted U-boats in the Bay of Biscay, and provided gunfire support off Normandy's beaches. When Operation Overlord began in June 1944, over half the destroyers covering the landings bore Goodall's structural fingerprints. They shielded the vulnerable troop transports and landing craft, absorbing shrapnel, shock, and shell fire. One vessel, HMS Jervis, took 2 near-miss bombs off Sword Beach, yet remained on station until dusk. Her captain later wrote, "The ship seemed to flex and breathe under the strain, but never faltered. We owed our lives to the men who built her." As the naval war reached its crescendo, the Royal Navy's destroyers had evolved from slender, fragile greyhounds into muscular, resilient warships, products of necessity and intellect. But beyond the statistics and engineering triumphs lay a deeper truth: the psychological shift within the service. The Royal Navy had rediscovered its faith in human ingenuity. After the despair of 1940, the losses at Norway, Dunkirk, and the Atlantic, the sight of ships surviving the unsurvivable rekindled a quiet pride. It was not victory in the glamorous sense. It was endurance, a national trait rendered in steel. And when, in May 1945, the guns finally fell silent, Britain's shipyards, scarred but unbroken, began to dismantle the camouflage nets and blackout curtains. Among the welders and engineers stood men who had spent the entire war building ships they would never sail, saving lives they would never meet. For them, Goodall's mad idea had become something far greater. Proof that even in the darkest hours of war, rational thought, careful craftsmanship, and patient courage could turn the tide. When the war ended in 1945, much of Britain's naval might lay at anchor, battle-worn, rusted, but still afloat. Among the ships returning to Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Scapa Flow were dozens of destroyers built under Goodall's guidance. Many bore scars from torpedoes, near misses, and bomb splinters. Yet, remarkably, they had survived. Naval inspectors touring the fleet that summer were struck by a simple fact. The new destroyers, though bruised and tired, were fundamentally intact. Hulls that had endured punishment no design manual had foreseen were still seaworthy. The unsinkable idea had not been arrogance. It had been engineering foresight. As Britain began to demobilize, the Admiralty convened a review board to examine wartime shipbuilding lessons. Its findings, published in 1946 as the Post-War Naval Construction Report, became the foundation of modern British naval architecture. The report concluded, "The principle of distributed strength, in conjunction with effective compartmentalization, has proven decisive in preserving buoyancy and stability under impact. Future ships must be built with survival as a design priority, not an afterthought." This single statement reshaped British maritime design philosophy. Goodall, now nearing the end of his long service, was invited to lecture at the Royal Institution and the Institution of Naval Architects. His speeches, delivered with quiet precision, drew standing audiences of young engineers eager to learn how Britain had kept its ships alive when the odds said otherwise. He emphasized not only technical innovation, but the human element. The draftsmen, welders, and riveters whose hands translated theory into endurance. "Steel remembers how it was shaped," he told one audience, "and men remember how they survived." In the late 1940s, the lessons of his destroyers began to ripple outward. Civilian shipbuilders adopted his compartmentalization methods for tankers and passenger liners. The emphasis on internal subdivision became standard practice in the post-war maritime world. Even commercial vessels, cargo ships plying routes to India and the Far East, quietly bore the DNA of wartime innovation. The Royal Navy, meanwhile, evolved into the jet age. New destroyers and frigates of the Daring and Leander classes carried forward the structural resilience of their wartime predecessors. These vessels, though bristling with radar and missile systems, were built around the same core principle. A ship must bend, but never break. Goodall retired from the Admiralty in 1949, his career spanning 2 world wars and countless revolutions in technology. He was knighted that same year, a modest man quietly elevated for his lifetime of service. He returned to Bath, where he continued to advise on civilian projects and write technical papers well into the 1950s. His correspondence with the Ministry of Supply reveals a mind still restless, still driven by curiosity. He died in 1969, the same year that the last wartime destroyers he had designed were finally decommissioned. By then, the world had moved on to nuclear submarines and guided missile frigates, yet the principles he pioneered remained deeply embedded in their steel bones. At the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, a small plaque commemorates his contribution. It reads simply, "Sir Stanley Vernon Goodall, engineer, architect, and guardian of the fleet." For decades, his name was known mainly among naval historians and shipwrights. But in the quiet corners of dockyards and museums, his influence endures. Every modern Royal Navy vessel, from destroyer to patrol ship, owes something to the mad design that once defied convention. In 2019, the Royal Institution of Naval Architects published a retrospective titled "Designs That Would Not Die." It opened with a sentence that could have been written in 1943. "In every age, Britain's strength at sea has come not only from courage in battle, but from the brilliance of those who built for survival." Today, when engineers study damage control simulations or design flood-resistant ships, they echo Goodall's legacy. His destroyers, born in the heat of war, tempered by mathematics and faith, remain symbols of what quiet determination can achieve. For Britain, the story of the Unsinkable destroyer became more than a technical achievement. It became a reflection of the national character itself, resilient, unshowy, and unyielding in adversity. And though their decks are long silent, the memory of those ships lives on in every hull that takes to the sea, carrying with it the same belief that defined a generation. That strength lies not in defiance, but in endurance. There is a quiet kind of heroism that never makes it into the headlines. It does not march in victory parades or echo in political speeches. It lives instead in the silent resolve of those who build, repair, and endure. The story of Britain's unsinkable destroyers belongs to them, to the minds and hands that refused to accept that loss at sea was inevitable. When we look back upon the Second World War, it is easy to remember the thunder of battle, the Spitfires above Kent, the tanks across Normandy. But beneath that clamor ran a quieter, steadier current, a war of intellect, fought in workshops and drawing offices where calculations replaced gunfire and courage took the form of perseverance. Sir Stanley Goodall's designs were never meant to make ships invincible. They were meant to give men a fighting chance, a few more minutes to act, a few more lives to save. That pursuit of endurance, rational and compassionate, embodies something deeply British, the belief that courage need not shout to be profound. In the cold, oil-slicked seas of the Atlantic and the burning blue of the Mediterranean, those destroyers proved that belief true. They bent, they burned, and yet they stayed afloat, as their nation did. The legacy of that endurance remains with us. It is there in the hum of naval dockyards, in the steady rhythm of welders' torches, in every vessel that carries Britain's ensign across the world's oceans. It reminds us that resilience is not born of defiance, but of understanding, of learning from failure and shaping strength from it. Goodall's mad idea was, in truth, an act of faith, faith in reason, in craftsmanship, in the quiet conviction that even in the darkest times, there is always a way to endure. And so the ships he built, the ones that would not sink, became more than war machines. They became emblems of a nation's spirit, scarred, steadfast, and unbroken. In the long silence after war, they leave us one enduring truth, that survival, like courage, is a choice made again and again, beneath the roar of history and the calm beneath the waves.